We did promise you that we're going to be talking about concussion in sport. There's been a few cases. In fact, last week, Stomers lock David Meihuizen was forced to retire in his 20s because he was told by doctors that he's had one too many concussions in a short career. He made his debut for the Stomers back in 2019, but already into retirement at the moment. And I'm joined now by Professor Jon Patricios. He is from the Wits University Medicine Department, and he is a sports medicine physician there. Professor Patricios, good morning, sir. Thank you so much for your time. Can you explain to us, in layman's terms, what concussion is? We always hear that a player is out for 2 weeks, for 3 weeks with concussion. What is it?
Concussion is a traumatic injury to the brain, which means there is some damage caused to the brain that manifests in the way the brain functions. In other words, it affects almost every aspect of how you work as a person. The difficulty with concussion, it's very difficult to see the damage that's occurred. So the normal scans, etc., that we do are almost always clear. And so we need to evaluate how that player or individual has changed in terms of their brain function. And that's the challenge when it comes to assessing these players.
Does it mean that every time there's a blow to the head, whether from a ball, from falling on the pitch, from a clash with another player, does it mean that there is literally something physically happening to your brain?
There is something physically happening, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad or permanent. So, the process of, for instance, headering the ball or taking contact may result in temporary changes which are perfectly reversible. It's when these changes become more severe and more sustained that we are concerned about them, because at that stage the brain becomes vulnerable, and if it's subjected to further blows before it's recovered from that initial insult, then the damage can become long-lasting and sometimes even permanent.
I'm sorry, Dr. Patricios, I want to understand in very basic terms here what the brain, or what happens to the brain as you take a blow. Does it shift? It may sound stupid.
No, it's not. It's not at all. I think that understanding is very inherent to this discussion. So the actual injury occurs not so much with the contact of the head against a knee, or the head against another head, or the head against the ground. The issue is the shaking of the brain inside the skull. Now, when the brain shakes inside the skull, two things potentially can happen. One is that the billions of nerves that operate in very complex networks can change. They can stretch, they can be twisted, they can temporarily change shape. The second thing is that the conduction of signals along those billions of nerve networks, in other words, the messaging from one nerve to another, is disrupted. So the chemicals that conduct those signals are shaken up, and the signaling becomes erratic in various areas of the brain. And as a result of that, whichever area of the brain is affected by that poor signaling will manifest function. In other words, that player will function poorly. If their balance center is affected, they will lose their balance. If their visual center is affected, they will have blurred vision and not be able to see. If their certain aspects of their physical manifestations are predominant, they might have headaches or nausea, etc. So it can affect any area of the brain, but the key issue is the signaling along the nerves in billions of networks is disrupted by the shaking of the brain inside the skull.
Professor Patricios, I mentioned at the beginning that David Meihuizen, the Stomers lock, had to retire early last week due to having had a lot of concussion, as per the doctors. How much is too much?
Yeah, that's a question we ask ourselves every day. And the true answer is we don't really know, and it's a very individualized thing. So you could have 4 concussions over a career of 20 years, and you recover fully from each of them, and that's not regarded as significant. But if you have 4 concussions as a 17-year-old in 1 year, that would be regarded as a red flag. So we have to assess each concussion individually and each context in its own rights. And we have what we call modifying factors, or factors which are likely to predispose you to more concussions and predispose you to longer recoveries. And in that situation, such as in the player you mentioned, you might look at the whole picture and say, listen, you've had several concussions over a short period. Each of them seems to be occurring more easily and manifesting more significantly. And we feel that you're at risk of some of the manifestations of changes of brain function not recovering fully. Yeah. And that's been highlighted much more in the last few years as retired footballers, rugby players, combat athletes have come forward and said, my brain is not what it used to be, and I think it might be due to the knocks I took when I played professional sport. And so we're much more aware of the potential dangers.
Let me come in there quickly, Professor Patricios. I don't have a lot of time. There's something called head injury assessment in rugby, as you know, and in football the rules are not the same. And there's been complaints that perhaps IFAB needs to change the rules to accommodate temporary subs in football for assessment of concussion. Is this your view? Is football not dealing with concussion perhaps as it should, or as seriously as it should?
So the short answer is yes. I'm concerned at what I see at some levels of professional football, where a short 3-minute on-field assessment in full view of the cameras and a crowd of 80,000 is supposedly sufficient to diagnose what is a potentially serious head injury. Where rugby has led the way is taking the player off the field for a dedicated period of time in a quiet environment and allowing that assessment to take place properly. And I think all levels of football should be following that lead.
All right, Dr. Jon Patricios, thank you so much for your time. We'll get you perhaps into studio for a lengthier interview on concussion, certainly a subject that needs more attention, and perhaps the powers that be might be persuaded to act a little bit more. That's Professor Jon Patricios from the Wits University Medicine Department.